Hi everybody, Professor Kauza here. Just want to give you all a brief video lecture to talk about the American and French revolutions and their significance. I'm not going to go through everything there is to cover on the revolutions in this video. I think the textbook chapter covers most of it pretty well. Just want to again sort of point out a few themes to help you think about the revolutions and their significance and how they fit into the longer story of world history. Starting with the American Revolution, I think obviously, at an American university, probably this is a fairly familiar ground to a lot of you in some respects. I just want to offer a few thoughts about the causes and consequences of the American Revolution. Causes-wise, two things are very often pointed to. One is the British effort to raise revenues out of their colonies in the Americas, which led to the famous motto on the part of colonists, "No taxation without representation." Which was indeed very significant as an immediate spark to the American Revolution. The other thing, of course, is the increasing popularity of Enlightenment political philosophy along the lines of John Locke, starting to argue that rather than royal absolutism, that political authority derives from the people in the form of a social contract. The government is accountable to people, and the popularity of this idea provided the philosophical framework within which to explain and justify an American effort towards revolution. Those are both true, and they are both significant. One thing to bear in mind is that they also need to be seen in the context of longer-term things that are going on in the Americas in a couple of different respects. One was that a lot had changed in Britain's American colonies since the 1680s or so. The restoration of the British monarchy and then the Glorious Revolution had led to a shift in policy in England where the royal government tried to govern the colonies much more directly. When they had originally been established, they had been established under joint trade corporations like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Plymouth Company, the Virginia Company, and had been largely self-governing. These companies had been granted charters from the royal government, and the colonists, under the way that the companies worked, were largely free to govern themselves. What you see after the 1680s, or from the 1680s onwards, is increasingly direct royal control, which naturally led to a lot more tension. You start having governors sent over from Britain getting into conflict with the sort of governing bodies that the colonists had already established for themselves. You see the companies losing their charters as the king starts trying to establish more direct control, that sort of thing. You also see heightened conflict in the colonies between the British and the other European colonial powers, particularly the French, also to a lesser extent the Spanish, which means you have more of a British military presence. The colonies are more and more becoming chess pawns in this global game for colonial power being played out. And again, the way in which these conflicts work out both give the colonists increasing opportunities to feel resentment towards the royal government on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. They also give colonists opportunities to gain military experience as they fight alongside the royal government. New experiences in governing themselves, in raising militias and raising armies, that kind of a thing, which creates a greater sense of distinctiveness, a greater sense of independence and autonomy, and a greater confidence in their ability to manage their own affairs by comparison to the way they see the British running them. There's also religious differences. There's economic development going on where you're shifting away from a sort of a frontier survival kind of economy in the colonies to something that's getting much more commercial, much more sophisticated, much more urban, and much more prosperous in a lot of ways. So all these things are kind of contributing factors to the colonies becoming prepared to the point where the particular disputes over taxation are going to spark off an American Revolution. Okay, the Americans, of course, do eventually wind up winning their independence as a result of the American Revolution. Not so much by militarily defeating the British, although military successes are essential there, but essentially it comes down to a contest of wills, where the British are trying to exert enough military force overseas to suppress the rebellion. The revolutionaries, on their part, need to be able to keep the revolution alive and viable long enough to bring in diplomatic pressure from the French and the Spanish in their favor long enough to persuade the British that it simply isn't worth all the cost in bloodshed and in money that it takes to, try and keep military forces operating overseas and trying to suppress the colonies that way. And eventually the colonists succeeded doing that, right? They don't need to win a victory where they're going to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and invade Britain. All they need to do is make it hard enough on the British Army in the Americas to persuade the British it's no longer worth the effort. And that's pretty much what winds up happening in the end. Okay, as far as consequences of the American Revolution, the famous phrase about the opening volley of the American Revolution being a shot heard around the world is indeed very literally true. The conflict gets picked up very rapidly in newspapers back in Europe, and they're sort of being spoken about in the salons and coffee houses of Enlightenment circles in Europe. And one really key thing here, something that's really distinctive about the American Revolution, is because of that component of Enlightenment political philosophy, the success of the American Revolution and the success that the Americans have establishing a form of government on their own, building it from scratch on Enlightenment principles, that is extremely interesting and extremely exciting to people who are interested in Enlightenment political philosophy in Europe, right? It's all very well to talk about this stuff in a coffee house or a salon in the abstract and talk about social contracts and inalienable rights and sovereignty deriving from the people and so forth. But here you've got people who have actually done it, right? There had been revolutions and, kings had been overthrown and such beforehand. But you had never really had one of these where people had the idea that after the revolution, they are going to construct an entirely new government from scratch, on the basis of their political philosophy. Even at the end of the English Civil War, back in the 17th century, you didn't invent a new government, you simply had Parliament, a much older institution, a traditional institution, you had a Parliament carrying on its own, right, trying to run the government by itself. You didn't have an attempt to reconstruct the government as a result of the English Civil War. So this is a very exciting, very new experiment, and it is very experimental and very exciting for people to try this. And what results, therefore, is the American Revolution inspires other revolutionaries in other places. Close to home, the most initial reaction in the 1790s, you get the Haitian Revolution. Starts off as a slave revolt, but the Haitian slaves, rebelling slaves, the Haitian blacks, very much model their uprising on the American one so that it becomes not just a slave uprising, but a Haitian War of Independence to imitate the American War of Independence. A little bit later, you're going to have revolutions breaking out in Latin America against the Spanish Empire, led by Simón Bolívar, and you're going to have this, eventual dismembering of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, leading to the creation of all the various independent countries of Latin America, Bolivia, named after Bolivar, Colombia, Mexico, and the others. And again, Bolivar and his fellow revolutionaries in Latin America very deliberately taking inspiration from and modeling their revolution on what they saw happening in the British colonies in North America. And then, of course, you get the French Revolution. One sort of final example here, well, actually, the French Revolution begins before the Latin American revolutions. Happens about simultaneously. The Haitian Revolution is kind of a response to the French Revolution as well, actually. But the French Revolution, again, back home in one of the major European kingdoms, again, taking inspiration from the Americans, taking inspiration from this idea that you can take Enlightenment political philosophy, overthrow an oppressive government, and reconstruct something entirely new in its place. This really sort of takes hold in France and becomes the starting point of the revolution there. In France, you get a couple things going on. Of course, Enlightenment political philosophy is one thing. Another thing that's going on, and sometimes the language is a little deceiving here in the French Revolution, another thing that's going on is a popular reaction against the ways that absolute monarchy had worked in practice. And this is one key thing. If you think about how we've talked about absolute monarchs and the nobility and the church in early modern Europe through the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. What had largely been happening was both the church and the nobles had been facing circumstances that had undermined the traditional basis of their power. right? The church, faced by the Protestant Reformation, was no longer in an independent position where it could criticize and challenge kings. So rather, churches became dependent on kings, because the kings were the ones who would choose would their kingdoms be Protestant or Catholic. So the church had sort of made itself very much into the cheerleader of royal absolutism, telling kings they ruled by divine right. So they had sort of been folded into the absolutist system, and as a result had their privileges enhanced and been very much protected and supported by kings, and had all sorts of legal and financial exemptions and privileges and special permissions and things. And the nobility, similarly, had been under pressure from the increasing wealth of the middle class, had been under pressure as it lost its traditional military dominance through gunpowder, bringing it into the castle and to knights in shining armor. So the nobility likewise had taken the opportunity to avoid losing their status by, again, going from a position where they were independent of kings and critics of kings and challengers to royal authority, or able to defy royal authority, and instead had really started building their status more and more and more on royal service, on being the king's agents in the locality, local communities, which in turn had won them, like the church, special tax privileges and legal privileges and exemptions and so forth that commoners didn't have, but people of noble birth would have, as the kings made deals with the nobles where he would grant them these special things to enable them to maintain their superior status over against sort of this rising commoners. What was happening, though, was that the power of the commoners was rising. The merchant classes were becoming increasingly powerful and wealthy and educated, and started more and more to resent the reservation of these particular kinds of powers and privileges and exemptions for people of noble birth only. And in a sense, that's a lot of what the French Revolution, what's a lot of what really triggered the French Revolution, was resentment against the way that the absolutist monarchy had fenced off the nobility and the church as a sort of special privileged set of individuals and institutions and families, calling rather for ideas of legal equality and equal rights and rights of political participation that were inspired by Enlightenment political philosophy. So the Enlightenment philosophy gave the intellectual, theory behind the French Revolution, but the practical resentment of the privilege of the nobility were what sort of made it into something that people wanted to actually go out and commit themselves to and take risks for in practice on the street of Paris or in the villages of France. The reason why I said the language could sometimes be deceptive is that the way that the French revolutionaries themselves would talk about these elite privileges they were trying to get rid of is they would often call it feudalism, and talk about it as though it was something traditional that went back to the Middle Ages, that went back time out of mind, and they're trying to bring in something completely new over against the sort of traditional medieval kind of a thing. My own specialty is medieval history, and the reality is that a lot of the things they were protesting against were not so much really practices or privileges that went back indefinitely into a feudal Middle Ages. There really wasn't such a thing. They really were a battery, a sort of a cluster of privileges that had been accumulating in the modern period, in the early modern period, as absolutist kings had sort of co-opted the nobles and the church into their own service. So that's kind of a key thing. Don't take it too literally there is some sort of traditional feudal order that the commons are rising up against, but rather what they're actually revolting against is the way that absolutism, as it had tried in a innovative kind of way, you could say, in a not all necessarily in a good sense, but in an inventive and creative way, had been trying to change the political order in the king's favor by co-opting privileged groups like the nobles and the church, and the wealthy people who didn't have the advantage of birth or church ordination, resenting the fact that people who were their equals in some sense in terms of wealth and influence and capability were being sort of granted special privileges that that leading middle class, merchant class kinds of people were not getting. Okay, the French Revolution itself, again, I think the textbook covers it adequately well. You have an initial phase of several years when the Estates General are meeting, trying to talk about ways to reform the government. As nothing happens and King Louis XVI kind of dithers and delays and doesn't do anything, you get increasingly radical ideas calling for increasingly massive overhauls of government and society, and increasing resentment towards the king until the king himself tries to flee. He gets caught, rather foolishly disguises himself as a peasant, but doesn't think to try and escape in a peasant wagon, tries to, dressed up as a peasant, but escaping in the royal carriage, which people spot going through the streets of Paris and pull over and realize what it is. The resentment builds up to the point that the king winds up being beheaded after he tries to flee the country. He gets accused of treason against the nation. At that point you enter a phase of terror in which you get really quite a bit of chaos and violence as people try to, you get these competing factions trying to reinvent the state completely in a rather murderous environment when the guillotine comes out as a major force. And then finally, after a year or two of the terror, people get sick of that. You have a kind of a leading committee called the Directory installed, which manages to restore order and end most of the bloodshed, but is not really capable, is kind of paralyzed, not capable of making decisions very well. And that, in turn, opens up the route for Napoleon Bonaparte, a military hero from wars going on in Italy, to come home, launch a military coup, and take over the government for himself, first wedging himself into the Directory, and then overthrowing the other directors and having himself pronounced sole supreme leader. Eventually, he'll have the Pope crown him emperor. Napoleon terrifies all the other monarchies of Europe around, and you then have a series of wars, the Napoleonic Wars, from the 1790s down through the early 1800s until Napoleon is finally defeated and exiled for good after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, about a 20-year period of warfare against the English, against factions in Spain, against the Austrians, against the Prussians, against the Russians, various alliances coming and going against Napoleon over that 20-year period. Napoleon has a huge impact on Europe, though, because in the course of this, he conquers one area after another. He's a spectacular military leader, spectacular general, wins a lot of victories. And as he goes, he reforms the politics of areas that he occupies. Places like the Holy Roman Empire in Germany. He takes what used to be tiny little independent cities and principalities, merges them together into areas where people speak similar dialects. You get more consolidated lands under more powerful political leaders. And he also, in addition to sort of consolidating this into things that are going to resemble nations a bit more, we'll talk about nationalism in the future, he also introduces legal reforms that grant things like shared legal rights for everybody. There's, no longer going to be special legal privileges for nobles or churches, but equal rights for everybody. More political participation, representative governing bodies, things like that. So that Napoleon, in a sense, is exporting the French Revolution, even though he himself is not a democratic leader. He himself is basically a military dictator, but in terms of things like law, legal privileges, and the status of nobles over against commoners in society, things like that, Napoleon actually does a lot to change French society and societies in places like Germany and Italy and Spain and other places. He's conquering, kind of exporting these Enlightenment-based kinds of revolutionary ideas in ways that are going to have a very long impact for the future, in which will endure after he himself gets defeated and his empire dismembered. You're still going to have a very long history resulting from these Napoleonic reforms that he does in Germany and Italy and these other kinds of places. Okay, so that's just a few themes I want to draw your attention to, thinking about what's going on in the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, this generation of revolutions between 1776 down to 1815. And I'll see you on the discussion boards. Thank you, guys.